Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I travel here all the way from Brooklyn. So I think my commute may have been easier, but it's great to meet all of you from many corners of the globe. So I run an organization called the Narrative Initiative. Our mission is to make equity and justice common sense. And for that reason, narrative for us is important because it's a means of engaging the process of sense making, how you create what becomes a common sense, both for individuals, but also acknowledging that sense making is also something that's held in communities. So the relationship between the individual and the community as well. So we distinguish very much like the folks at Oxfam, different levels, differences between stories and narratives and values and worldviews. At the most surface and maybe the most confusing level, we think of things like tweets and messages, but then we think of stories beneath them and narratives beneath them, and values and worldviews ultimately really at the core and at the base. But the narratives are really important because you can't simply approach someone or a community and engage them at the level of and this is one of the presidential candidates of the Democratic Party. It's Elizabeth Warren. There's a very well-known saying called "I have a plan," and she uses that really to, I think, put forward a semi-narrative and one that's trying to capture the meaning or the meaning of the value of security, essentially. What she's saying is that there is a threat, corporate greed, the elites, monopoly power, that requires very smart plans that she can protect us from and from these threats. And all the stories that she tells about her childhood, about people that she meets, are meant to reinforce this narrative. Uh, so that's one example. The next, does anyone know who this is? Show of hands if you know who this is. Oh, wow, it's very popular. This is my favorite and only Asian American running for president, Andrew Yang, although Kamala Harris is technically half. Um, and Andrew Yang also has a quasi narrative, this thing called the freedom dividend, which is basically a universal guaranteed income where he would write a check, the US government would write a check every month to every American citizen to in what he calls a freedom dividend. And I would offer that Andrew Yang and Elizabeth Warren are offering competing narratives to contest the meaning of the value of security. And in this case, Andrew Yang thinks that this is a mode of security from the threat of robots, essentially, from automation. Uh, and he has created a narrative, and all of the stories that he offers about the cash register workers who no longer have jobs, or the truck drivers who will not have jobs in a decade from now, are meant to buttress this narrative. But what, as I mentioned before, um, uh, we believe that there are things called deep narratives that are often not visible that animate these narratives. And these are two examples of people offering narratives pointing to the same value of security, but in fact, they are premised on very different deep narratives. And the deep narrative that I would point to in this case is around the role of government. And in the case of Elizabeth Warren, I have a plan is really an argument for a very robust role of government in protection, in security. And in Andrew Yang, who is a tech entrepreneur, and even in this very specific language of a dividend, which is kind of an economic language around shareholder profits and rights, Andrew Yang really does not put forward a deep narrative or is not premised on a deep narrative of a more robust government that can serve this function. So I just offer this very simple diagram that we use to illustrate um, different levels that I mentioned. And the ocean is a very intentional one because we think that narratives are like currents and that currents generate waves at the top of the ocean and they're often invisible and that currents are often contradictory. So it's not like you have consistent narratives always, but that you can combine and repurpose currents to drive stories and messages And ultimately, at the top of the ocean is when you're fighting with tweets, essentially. So this is a metaphor that I would offer just as a framework. So I would also say that in addition to this framework, we also one of our core beliefs is that narrative change is multidisciplinary. It certainly requires really sophisticated strategic communications, but it's not just about communications. Uh, Narratives are formed and reinforced in how you design protests and policy, and also in the workplace and in the subway, not just on your screens. And narrative ultimately cannot be separated with questions of power. It's not like narrative is a way to get around the question of economic power or political power. It's simply a tool and can't be separated from these other modes of power.